All right. And I love to have more of a conversational aspect whenever I give presentations. So I'll be stopping at certain points in the presentation. If you have any questions, or if like you have a really burning question and you want to ask it, feel free to like type it in chat and we'll get to it when we can. So I'm going to jump right in then. Today we're going to talk about writing for voice and voice user interfaces, or as I like to call it, designing with language, not just with what you see, but what you hear and what you read. So a little bit about me before we start, my background. I'm a current master's student at HCD. I'm in my last year. So excited. I am in capstone right now. Before I moved to Seattle to join UW, I got my undergraduate degree at James Madison University, which for those of you who may not know is in Virginia on the East Coast. So it was a big change going from East Coast to West Coast for me. While I was studying at JMU, I was introduced to the world of human-centered design through a course, and that really changed my life. I went from having a full force narrow mindset of going into a journalistic career or just strictly writing into expanding into how we can bring writing into the tech industry and where does that fit into these real life applications. Some other fun facts about me is that last year I was a part of a directed research group that worked on co-design practices with older adults, pre-pandemic, of course. It was really interesting in learning how people think through problems and technologies at different stages of life. And I recently finished an internship at Amazon in design research. So I love human-centered design. But throughout it all, writing, human-centered design and everything, my philosophy in going through these projects is focusing on the situation and the story. So finding out the situation of the person, place, or thing that we're going to be designing for, and then help writing that story of how that design interacts with the person, place, or things situation. So how can we rewrite or change or affect that story and write the ending? So today I'm going to talk a little bit about what VUI is, because it seems like we have a bit of a split 50-50 experience with VUI. Then go into the meat and potatoes about how writing for voice is and what does that mean to write for a voice personality. And then I'll walk you through a project example that I made for a graduate class at University of Washington. If we have time, we can talk through some common tools for voice user interface design and a few of my book recommendations and some Q&A. So what is a VUI, a voice user interface? VUI is more common than you might think, even though it's still a relatively new field. So if you have an Alexa or Google Home or even even Siri on your phone. Oh, I think that was my Alexa going off in the background. If you have Alexa, Google Home, or even Siri, those are all voice assistants who are voice user interfaces. So they are more prevalent than you might think. But the core component of making something a VUI as opposed to a GUI, a graphical interface, is all the user interaction is through voice and sound. So from a designer's point of view, what does that look like to be a VUI designer? That means creating deliverables like a dialogue flow, which is a master map of how a voice interface will respond to things. If a user asks a question or says a statement in a certain way, how does a voice assistant respond to that? Creating dialogue samples and paths. So what is an ideal path for a user to take? If they say this, then the VUI will answer like so. And giving an example for your design team and anyone working on the project to really look at and get a feel, a picture for what this experience would look like. For paths and samples, there's something we call the happy path and the error path. The happy path is where things go as you predicted, that you kind of had an idea of how things would go from. And an error path is where things go unexpectedly, where a user might ask a question you weren't sure, you didn't even think would be in the realm of this voice interface. And then lastly, from a designer's perspective, you have to think about the entire experience of voice user interfaces. You know, where is the user spatially? What type of language does the user speak? Does the user expect an informed and more informational style, or more of a sense of humor when they're interacting with a voice interface? So 3 things about VUI that are important is voice, number 1. It's in the name, it's the core component. And in voice, it operates in 2 kind of arenas. The first arena is how you phrase things, or what language you choose to use when making a voice user interface. And the second part of the arena is how you choose to deliver that information or that communication. So how you phrase it is language. That could be informational, scientific. In the case of making a COVID voice assistant, you might draw information from scientific sources. In the case of making what should I watch on Netflix type of voice assistant, you might draw your information from other places. And how you deliver it. So this goes into the sound quality of your voice interface. Is this a female voice, a male voice, a young voice, an old voice? Do they speak in a certain manner, in an informed manner, in a relaxed manner? Voice is very important to VUI, and it can shape the entire experience for your user. Experience is the next one. So you have to understand through user research, you know, why are people using a voice interface? Why is a voice interface the best option for whatever you're designing for? And where is that user in both physical space and in mindsets? Are they multitasking? Are they in the same room? Are they holding the voice assistant up to their hand, or is it far away from them on their desk? So these are things you have to take into account when you're designing a voice user interface. Lastly, communication. So in my experience working with voice user interfaces, both through classes and other side projects, VUI is all about communicating what you can do, what you can't do, and when things go unexpectedly. So knowing immediately what your voice can do, I can answer questions about weather. That's one use case. Can help inform your user on how they're supposed to interact with this voice assistant. If a user came up and say, hey, I want to have a recipe for deep fried Oreos, and your voice assistant only talks about weather and fashion, you need to have some sort of plan to communicate what your voice can or cannot do for that user. As I mentioned earlier, VUI is a relatively new field in design, but it's not like created yesterday new. It's evolved from a couple of other different designs throughout history, one of them being automated answering. So if you had ever called someone or an organization and had to dial in numbers and click pound or star, those were some of the origins of a voice user interface design, and how that was structured transitioned to how some voice assistants and user interfaces are structured today. Other things that come up, I won't dive too deeply into it during my presentation, but are in the arena, are some ethics and discussions going on around the voice user interface community. So a lot of people ask, why are voice assistants having female voices? There's a whole psychology behind it that is actively discussed. I have the book recommendation at the end, but there is research to back up why there are female voices for voice assistants. And then the topic of privacy also comes up with ethical considerations for voice assistants as well. How do you communicate privacy concerns? How do you address privacy concerns? And how do they vary between your users? And then lastly, many of the voice interfaces, at least in the United States, are trained off of a certain type of language when they speak, and that would be mainstream English. Some people call it the Pacific Northwest accent, is what most of these assistants are trained on. And that leaves a lot of room for, improvement, iteration, and creation in the future to address other populations who may have a strong dialect or an accent or speak another regional version of American English, or even bilingual households. So there's a lot of evolution going on and a lot of discussion about how we should approach these designs and how should we create these vocabularies and terminologies voice interfaces work off of. So that was just a brief introduction about what a voice user interface is. I'll just pause if there's any questions about that I can address before jumping into writing for a personality.
I had a quick question for you. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit. I don't know if you might get to it in that throughout your presentation, but is there kind of a reason why the decision to create these smart speakers like Amazon Echo and all these things, like why, we have, like virtual assistants in our phones already. So, that's just an example. Like, is there some type of, why is the smart speaker the next, I guess, natural progression for technology?
That's a really great question. I don't know the exact answer for that,
That's
but
fine.
there is an evolution going on. Research is definitely needed more in the VUI field. I'm a big advocate for research. But what you're, just to clarify, you're talking about a headless experience versus a multimodal experience. For a
Right.
headless experience, that would be an Echo. You wouldn't have any sort of screen and rely totally on sound. And
Right.
the others have screen or other elements that help the user be informed of what's going on.
Right. Yep.
Yeah, that's a good question. I wish I had an answer.
That's okay.
Rebecca also has her hand raised.
Oh, thank you. I guess to answer that previous question, I would also guess there's something about having a shared device for multiple people in a household. And I think phones are often like a private, just something you carry in your pocket and not something that anybody can have access to at any time. But my question was, I was just curious about what you shared with the research about female voices being selected for voice assistants, and if you could share some of the research either in the chat or maybe afterwards, or share more thoughts about that, because it's something I've struggled with, because it feels kind of sexist that women are like helping people all the time through voice assistants.
Yeah, there's definitely an ongoing discussion about, who do you hire, or to what degree do you have a human voice actor embody your voice assistant? And that is all discussed in a book. I have it at the end of the presentation. I'm happy to pop in like an Amazon link or send it to Dayton if there's a follow-up email or anywhere to share resources on that. But the long and short answer of that is they conducted a series of research studies and experiments, I believe in the University of California, I'm not 100% sure, where they studied how humans react to voices and different cadences of voices in different situations, whether they were being informed or judged or various activities. So that's the long and short answer. That's where that decision mostly comes from. Okay, those were really great questions. I still see your hand raised, Rebecca. Do you have a follow-up question?
Oh, no, sorry, that's an accident. Thank you.
Oh, okay, cool. I'll just jump right into how to write for a voice personality in my experience, and we'll pause at another point for any questions on that note, if you guys have any. So writing for voice is what I like to call designing with language. I think in the UX world in general, most people think, oh, UX is UI, the user interface, but it's much more than the user interface, what you interact with graphically. It's how you interact with it, what are the before and after aspects of the design. And it's also what the language is and the communication aspect is of a design. So user experience is way more than just what you see. It's like the iceberg, where you have the tip of the iceberg seen and everything underneath is in existence. So when you're writing for voice, it's a lot of fun because it's character creation. It's figuring out the who, what, where, when, and why of this new user interface. And how does it think? How does it speak? Why does it speak that way? What is it trying to tell you? What is it not trying to tell you? How would it interact with people? You know, what type of people does it interact with? It's like creating a story for it. And most of those characteristics and aspects come from understanding your audience. So it's the great chicken and egg scenario of human-centered design, research and iterate, and research and prototype, and research and iterate again. So you can best understand who you're designing for and what's the situation of that person or place or thing. I'm not excluding place design. So you have to understand, you know, what are the goals and speaking style of your audience, of your users? How do they expect to communicate with someone? Do you want this voice interface to be super friendly, like as if it was another person? Or do you want to create more distance in that character and keep a kind of a boundary where you know that this is not a person, it's a voice interface? And that's something called the uncanny valley, which does come up when you're crafting a voice assistant or a voice personality. How far can you go to making it too formal or too informal? And how do users react to that? This also means you have to understand how familiar are the people you're going to be designing for with voice technology. Would there be high levels of distrust? How would you address those levels of distrust? And how easy is it to understand this interface? You know, do they speak with a sense of humor, especially sarcastic humor? You have to be really tight in both your character development for this voice personality and your delivery so that it's understood that this was a sarcastic sense of humor type of comment rather than something completely deadpan and serious. And then, like creating any other character, if you've done any like theater work, writing work, or any creative work, period, consistency is a big point in creating an ethos or credibility for your character. So having style guides on the back end of how this voice interface would say hello or greet someone in a consistent manner, and training them on the vocabulary necessary. So if I were to create, again, like a COVID-19 voice assistant, I would have to train them on the terminology, like this is what a virus means, this is what a treatment means, this is what yada, yada, yada does. And sometimes vocabulary training could include more research, but on the opposite end, rather than researching with your user, you would research with subject matter experts. But essentially what you're doing is you're creating a character, getting inside their head and thinking, how do they think, how do they speak, and how do they communicate to your user? And alternatively, what's the best way for them to communicate with their user? What I like to do when I create a voice personality or a digital personality, this may also include chat bots, is fill out this worksheet, which I just recently discovered was created by a good classmate and friend of mine in the HCD program while she was working at Microsoft. This outlines a couple of key components when you're designing a personality, like the character development. What are the traits that you want this voice personality to really exude? What's important? Do you want them to be upbeat and cheerful, or do you want them to be informed and with a high credibility? Alternatively, what do you want to avoid? Do you want to avoid sarcastic humor, or do you want to avoid judgmental statements, or could be perceived as judgmental? Again, it depends on your user research. You also need to make a good case for why people would use your voice interface or your voice personality, and understanding this will help you in writing for it inside the personality. What's the goal for using it, and why would they use it? It's very easy to say, I want to design or have a voice user interface because all these other companies and products have a voice component. But there should be a reason for you to have this voice component rather than everybody else has it, I need to have it too. And then lastly, this bottom section is an exercise in thinking about use cases and scenarios people would be interacting with your voice. So if someone's using my voice interface to get a recipe about cooking, they could ask about ingredients they have, ingredients they need, or recipes they want. And my voice interface will respond in these ways, exuding these characteristics and traits. So it's a good exercise to have on the back end. At the bottom of the screen is a example of how to write a style guide for a voice interface or a chatbot, but it's still a relatively new concept, and like everything else in HCD, it's always evolving, and it's always depending on the phrase, it depends. So here's an example of a filled out sheet, or a in work in progress filled out sheet, where you have a reason, learn about their skin type, 3 things that could happen, and then how it could respond, traits they want to embody, and traits you want to avoid. Okay, so writing, you have all of that together. You've created this personality. If you're in HCD, it's like creating a character persona, but on the opposite end, not of your user, of your product. You have to wonder, like, how can I test and how can I confirm or verify that things are going in a way that I may have predicted, or find holes in my design and writing that I hadn't seen before. And from here, we draw a lot of practices from the humanities, especially in the theatrical and writing practices, like doing a read through, grabbing a script or sample dialogue that you've written about your voice assistant and how they would respond, and then grabbing a friend down the hallway or whoever's on your team and have them read part A and you read part B and see how it sounds, how it flows, if it flows. Additionally, you can grab a random person, again, from your team or someone who hasn't interacted with your product or design before, and say, hey, I'm a voice assistant for da 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 da. Ask me a question, and then listen to what type of questions and comments they have for you. This is a great exercise to figure out more use cases and arenas people might interact with your voice interface. And then when you finally have a tight, like, example dialogue and your flowcharts are out and you really, really want to do some hardcore user testing or usability testing, Wizard of Oz methodology works really great. You don't always need to have a fully formed robotic voice or chatbot read out your script. You can do Wizard of Oz testing yourself with that. So in summary, when you're writing for a voice, it has these 3 components, right? So you have your user and all the user research you've done to understand your audience and how they would like to interact with something or someone on the topic you're designing for. The voice itself, so how you deliver it, what type of voice do you want, young, old, male, female, etc. And what you're delivering. What is the vocabulary and the dictionary and the use case for this voice when you're writing for it. And I hope it works, but here's an example of how a written voice would sound all put together.
Hey there, I'm Missy, your personal skincare assistant, passionate about making your face rise and shine, honey. I can help you learn about your skin type, chat about skincare product ingredients, and set a routine. What do you want to do?
All right, I hope you could hear that. If not, then you just saw me stare at the screen for a little bit. And that's a little bit about writing for a personality, writing for a voice assistant, and um, the whole shebang about creating a character on that. So I think what I'm going to do is go straight into this quick overview of Missy, the voice assistant that I created last year for a project. And then we can do questions on whatever part y'all would like to chat about. Okay. Ooh. My bad. There we go. So Missy, the first thing I had to do when creating this voice assistant for skincare and skincare users was figure out why would I use voice. So the rationale behind using a voice assistant for a skincare scenario is that you are going to be needing your hands free, so you can't interact with the device usually. There's going to be liquids involved, so you typically don't want any danger happening around those devices. And you are approaching a topic that might have some confusion or levels of frustration. So being able to talk through those topics is sometimes helpful for users to better understand and complete exercises that they need to. Exercises being like skincare routines. Going forward from that, I decided, okay, I'm gonna make a skincare voice assistant that focuses on educating people about their skin type and finding their skin type with a quiz. Then I'm gonna help them set and remind themselves to do skincare routines and answer some questions about skincare ingredients and health and be informative. Once I had that in my brain, I decided to dive deep into the research part of any HCD product. I did a competitive analysis and tried to see what was out there already for skincare. What were people using to learn about their skin type? An example of that would be the Ulta skincare quiz, where they took a picture of your face and highlighted different places and explained what might be going on there. Doing that competitive analysis helped me narrow scope and understand, oh, I think skincare is a bigger opportunity for me to do things in rather than, makeup care. Knowing that at the same time, I decided to dive deep into the YouTube underworld, and I spent hours and hours listening to influencers and how they talked about skincare and how people who followed them talked about skincare. And I learned from there the style and language that I wanted my voice assistant to have. Many of these influencers were upbeat, they were bright, they were informed, but they also talked a lot about themselves. And unfortunately, due to Instagram and YouTube comments, the users didn't like that as much. So I knew to avoid a lot of language that was more self-centered and to rather focus on how the information my informed, upbeat skincare assistant had could apply to the user's experience. While I was diving deep in the YouTube underworld, I deployed a survey to understand what frustrations and steps were involved in skincare. And this would help me plan out my master flow and how many options I would need to give my users if they were to interact with my voice assistant. Did a couple of user interviews to dive deeper into those survey findings. And then finally did Wizard of Oz testing to see how people would respond, what questions they would ask, and if any of my predictions held true. So I mentioned spending time in the YouTube underworld to understand how people talked about skincare and what language they used and communicated. These are examples of some of the key messages that my skincare assistant would say. A wake message of like, hey there, it's Missy, very friendly, bright, optimistic. Completion messages like, my work here is done. So it's more of a personality rather than an informed or a factual voice assistant. And then error message, how is it going to handle things when things go unexpectedly? Like, wow, that's embarrassing. I don't know about that. I'd look for that information somewhere else. I can help you with X, Y, and Z. Giving those users an option to do something else, not just completely shutting down the conversation. So while I was working all of this research, I kept adding to my flowchart, and I thought, oh, I'm going to do this amazing voice assistant. It's going to be a one-stop shop for everything that has to do with your face. And it was too much. So I went back and looked at my research and my timeline, and I decided to narrow my scope down so that if you follow this flowchart, you have your starting message here the first time they interact with the voice assistant, and then 4 options from there. One of them being, well, really 4 options, and then one being like, I didn't understand you option. And as you can see, they have let's see what's a good example. This one, a happy path where it's a yes, very short, and an error path where it's a no. And oftentimes with error paths, it can loop back to whatever the previous message was. Oops. All right. Just a note on the usability in Wizard of Oz testing. This is something I found was helpful when I did my usability testing on this project, was using my master dialogue flow and following that, where I would embody the voice assistant and respond on the fly using the chart to whatever my participants were saying, and then taking stickies and adding those as I went through the chart. So either like a finding, like Missy should have access to specialists and resources to direct users to, or they were expecting to hear something else about products rather than ingredients. Yep, this is an example of a core case or a sample path. This is a happy path where they find their dry skin type and ask questions about it, and Missy gives them an answer on it. But as always, knowing what went right is not always as exciting as what went wrong. I think the way that you can handle unexpected things can test a lot about whatever you're designing. So I'm going to play for you an example of an error path.
Hey, Missy, are bananas good for my skin type? I'm sorry, I don't think I understand. Would you mind repeating that? Bananas. Are bananas good for my skin? I don't know the answer to that. Jeez, how embarrassing. Sorry.
The other one's really long. But in short and in summary, Missy still has a lot of work to do. And it's still very much in a prototype stages. But we know that she's cheerful, conversational, informative. She has a working terminology and vocabulary in the works. And she's got some sort of idea of how users are going to interact with her in the future. So that being said, I'm almost at the end of my presentation, I promise. And even though I'll be almost finished with my presentation, vui never is. Vui never ends because there are so many things that could happen. People are unpredictable, so is vui. You're never finished, in the words of my friend Stephanie and a former vui writer. She used to write for a couple of voice assistants. There's always new ways people are communicating. There are always new ways people expect to be responded to. And there's always different languages to be included as well. So the vui work is never finished. If you're thinking about entering vui, just go in with your eyes open. There's a lot of work to be done, and it's probably never ending. Okay, I have a couple of reading recommendations for those of you who might be interested in diving deeper into what voice interfaces are and what voice writing looks like. And I am a strong believer that reading makes you a better writer. And if you're a better writer, I'm biased, but I think it makes you overall cooler. The first recommendation I have is William Strunk and White's Elements of Style. This is for everyone involved in the human-centered design field or the UX field. I think everyone should read this. It's a short guide on how to write in American English and how to write concisely and fully. So I really love it. I call it the American English Writing Bible, but it's there if you need it. The second one is Wired for Speech. This is the research book I had mentioned earlier. This talks about how people react and expectations when it comes to voice interfaces in different scenarios. It discusses a couple of different research studies and experiments that they did to understand, why a female voice, why a young voice, why an old voice, and how people interacted. There's a particularly interesting study about driving in this book and how people responded when their GPS unit rated their driving style. And then lastly, I have to recommend this book, Designing Voice User Interfaces, written by Kathy Pearl. Kathy Pearl is the all-star rock star of voice user interfaces. She has worked on all of the major interfaces, Cortana, Alexa, Google Home, Siri. She's worked on them all, plus more. I believe she also worked at Nuance Communications, which was the precursor company to voice interfaces. This goes into the entire process. I've only just scratched the surface. And it has the theories, the theoretical findings, and the practical exercises in this book. So I highly recommend. If you're at UW, you get all 3 of these books for free through the UW library. If not, there are other options to find them, I'm sure. So that was my presentation. I just wanted to say thank you to Dayton and the UX team for having me here and letting me geek out about voice writing and voice interfaces. And I've had a blast. So if you have any questions, I'd love to chat.
Thank you, Teresa. First off, I have a question for you. Designing VUIs, are there any engineering limitations or constraints that we have to keep in mind?
So I'm not sure. I like to think, design is kind of the sky's the limit type deal. But communicating what it is most important. So when you're creating your master flows, this might be sort of answering your question. That's what you would hand off to like engineering teams and developers, because they would communicate how many steps you would need for your voice interface and how it would need to react. But I mean, sky's the limit when you're designing, in my opinion. Think big and then work toward that goal.
Thank you.
Hi, Teresa. I'm Ding Yu. I have a question.
Hi.
Yeah, I'm actually I'm also a graduate student from San Jose State University, so I'm not from UW, and I'm very interested in the project you have just presented because this semester I'm also working on a voice assistant project, and also I'm designing the flow at this point. But my question is just about the Wizard of Oz methods you have mentioned. So is that a kind of like a way to test the prototype? Could you please elaborate more about that?
Yeah, so just for those who may not know, Wizard of Oz testing is just like the scene in the Wizard of Oz. You have someone behind a curtain who pretends to be your product or service, and you have a user or a participant in front of you who interacts with that person behind the curtain. In the case with this voice assistant, what I've done is I would like hide my face. This was kind of during the emerging COVID times, so I could hide my camera and just have them react to the sound of my voice as I was reading the prompts or following my dialogue flow. That, or you could do pre-recorded. I've started to do that toward the end of my project, where you have a voice actor or yourself or your roommate. You have them read the voice script, and then you record them and have that played as they go through your usability test.
I see. Because the reason why I have got this question is I'm thinking about, because I'm using the software called like Fable to build the call flow. So they have the kind of, when you type out all those call flows, there's the like a avatar that can basically voice out all the call flows. So I'm just curious about like why you pick this like to recording instead of like a software stuff.
Yeah, so my primary motivation in that was because I knew I wanted to have a certain tone and cadence to the voice that I was designing. I know a couple of people in projects who have chosen to use more of the automated voices, and there's nothing wrong with that. It just depends on, your audience and your design. I'm not familiar with that tool, but I would love to Google it and look at it later. I've been using mostly Lucid Charts to do my VUI work. So there's tons of tools out there, and they're all evolving.
Yeah, I can send a link to the chat so everyone can see it. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Question.
So I have a question, Teresa. I'm pretty new to this. I don't know a lot about this topic, so this may be out of left field, but I'm just wondering, is typically the entire dialogue sequence with a user, is it scripted out by the designer ahead of time, like entirely, or do algorithms start to take hold at a certain point, / like how is that technology impacting this? So just wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, so I don't have too much experience in that field, but yes, algorithms can respond to it, to my knowledge anyway. And no, the writers aren't scripting out everything. That's just a guide for the design team and the prototyping team to get a feel for how this interaction would look and what they might need to train their voice assistant or algorithm to listen for to recognize patterns.
Hi, Teresa. I just have a very quick question on the database. So I was curious how it was connected with the UX design that you had.
Oh, the database and dictionaries? Yeah, so as I was going through the skincare research that I had done, I had realized there were certain standards of terminology used. So like, skincare ingredients was one. So what I did was I created basically a list of these terms and their definitions and where they might be recognized as in different pronunciations and such. So that's where that is. If I were working with like a company or I had a developer team, I'd probably hand that off to them and maybe even a sound designer to recognize those patterns and feed that into the learning. I'm not sure if that answers the question.
Yeah, it totally did. Thank you.
Cool. Rebecca?
Thank you. I love your talk. Thank you. This was really informative. I had a question about if you've had any experience with doing like co-design with voice assistants and like if sort of facilitating other people to create their own scripts or things like that. And if that's something that's possible, or do you see that there needs to be a lot of expertise to actually program voice assistant responses?
That's really interesting. I personally haven't done any co-design practices in regards to VUI. That would be really cool. I don't know how that would work right now, and I haven't heard of that happening in my experience. My gut says it's possible, but it would probably look really low tech, kind of like writing on the napkin mentality of when you're just drawing a design on your napkin. It would probably look more like a down and dirty and a rapid prototype or an improv session. But no, I don't know of that ever happening. I'm sorry, what was your second question?
I think that that answers it. Just like if it's something that an expert needs to create, because like once you program a certain, like for example with your skincare voice assistant, is that something you would then put in an app store, or I guess that's the database that people are referring to?
Yeah, it could be put in an app store. I'm of a design philosophy that thinks more of physical spaces and things. So when I originally started this idea, I thought of it being in a mirror that would have speakers in it and microphones at the bottom of the mirror. So you could place it in like different areas you would do your skincare routine. So I was thinking more around the realm of devices, but yeah, it could be in an app or as well. That would, either way, they would have to link to that database on the internet somewhere.
Cool, thank you.
I have one more question. Could you name a few other use cases for VUIs besides personal assistants?
Let's see, let me think of a couple on the top of my head. When you don't necessarily need a personal assistant for it. So if you just wanted to have a person interact with something on the voice, like start oven, bake at 355, that would be a voice user interface as well. Or through, like I mentioned, the automated answering machines, that's also a voice interface decision. It's more multimodal, but you would select an option and guide you through that. I'm blanking on a couple of other use cases, but they're definitely out there as you look farther back in time, or even using, I think Comcast has a controller where you can press a microphone and say like, play Netflix, and it'll do it for you. Yeah, I hope that answers the question. Google's a great place. I like to Google things all the time.
Yeah, it does. And Aaron said vehicle infotainment systems as well in the chat.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, like a GPS and all of that. Yeah.
If there aren't any more questions, this is right about the time we're at 4 o'clock. Or any last questions before we end here? Sorry. Okay. Yeah, thank you, Teresa, so much for joining us. This is great, very informative. So thank you for taking the time out.
Yeah. Thanks for having me geek out here. I enjoyed it. And you got some really great speakers coming up. I know at least 2 of them, and they're doing really cool work.
We're excited. We're excited. Thank you everyone for joining. If you saw the link in the chat, if you want to sign up for our newsletter, and stay updated with our events. If not, we'll see you next time. Thank you.